Elizabeth Warren opened up in public, more emotional than usual. She spoke of roots, of culture, of what she still carries. Then Senator Kennedy leaned forward. One word, just one, and the entire crowd froze. Like and subscribe, and tell us, does identity still belong in politics? They called it a conversation on representation. What they got was a collision of two Americas. The auditorium was packed. Cameras rolled quietly in the back. No campaign signs, no flags. Just a stage, two armchairs, a moderator's table, and a neutral Navy backdrop with the title, Voices in Government, Representation, Identity, and Power. Senator Elizabeth Warren sat stage left. She wore a dark cranberry jacket, glasses, and the kind of practiced warmth that had carried her through years in politics. She wasn't there to campaign. She was there to explain. Stage right, Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. No blazer, open collar, hands folded in his lap. His eyes scanned the crowd as if sizing up the room. Not hostile, just precise. He hadn't said much since arriving. The moderator, a respected journalist from PBS, opened with a simple premise. We're not here to debate identity politics. We're here to ask how identity shows up in law, policy, and leadership. And if it should. The audience nodded. A few pens came out. It was the kind of crowd that claps after nuance, not zingers. Warren went first. She talked about education disparities, about her time as a law professor, about what it felt like to not be taken seriously because of how you sounded or what people thought you were. It was standard at first, well delivered, polished. But then something shifted. Warren paused mid-sentence, lowered her voice just slightly, and said, I don't talk about this often, but growing up, I always felt like I had to prove who I was, twice as hard, because people didn't think a girl from Oklahoma could make it. And when I finally did, they told me I had lied about who I am. A few gasps, one person near the front visibly leaned forward. That stays with you, she added. Even when you win, it never really leaves. The moderator gave her a moment, then turned to Kennedy. Senator, what's your perspective on how identity shapes political trust? Kennedy didn't move. He glanced down at his notes, though it wasn't clear if he was reading or just giving the silence a little more weight. I'll get to that, he said. But first, I want to hear more of what Senator Warren just said, because I think there's something deeper there. The crowd went quiet. No one expected that tone, and no one expected what was coming next. The first tear wasn't visible. The second caught the spotlight. Senator Warren straightened in her chair. This wasn't campaign mode, Warren. No hand chops, no applause lines. This was something else. You know, she said slowly, when people say identity politics, it's usually with a sneer. But to me, identity was never political. It was survival. She looked out into the audience. When I was a kid, my mom worked the phones for Sears. My dad had a heart attack when I was 12. We nearly lost the house. And people would ask me, what are you? Where are you from? What do you believe you are? A beat. When you spend your childhood proving you're enough, and then spend your adulthood being told you're too much, it stays with you. She paused. Then without warning, her voice cracked. My family didn't come from power, but we came from something just as real. And I claim that, even when the world didn't want me to. A hush fell across the room. Even the moderator didn't move. This wasn't the soundbite, this was the scar. Warren took a breath, shaky but grounded, and pressed on. Yes, I identified with a heritage that I believed was mine. And yes, I've taken the hits for that. But when people use that to erase the rest of me, the work, the story, the grit, I have to ask, what exactly do they want me to apologize for? There was no applause, just stillness. A few heads nodded. One student near the front wiped their eye. Senator Kennedy sat motionless. He hadn't written anything down, hadn't leaned forward, just watched. Then, after a long pause, the moderator offered him the floor. Senator Kennedy, your response? He took a breath, looked at Warren, then at the audience. Then he leaned slightly forward, not with aggression, not with judgment, and said, Weepdom, that was it. One word. No tone, no glare, just curiosity. but it sliced through the moment like glass. Warren blinked. The moderator froze. The audience collectively held their breath. Because in a world of arguments and slogans, Kennedy had just asked something almost extinct in public life. A question with no framing, no traps, just a raw, honest ask. It wasn't the word itself, it was how he said it, and when. Kennedy had dropped a pin in the middle of Warren's emotional arc. No aggression, no mockery, just that single word. Why? It didn't accuse, it didn't provoke, it just held up a mirror and waited. Warren blinked, not because she was rattled, but because she hadn't expected it. She opened her mouth, then paused. The moderator glanced down nervously at his note cards, but Kennedy said nothing more. He didn't fill the silence, didn't elaborate, just kept looking at her, quietly asking for something no one else on that stage had the courage to demand. Clarity, Warren finally spoke. Why are you here? Because it matters, because representation matters, because too often people in power don't understand what it means to be dismissed, to be questioned, to be doubted. Her voice was steady, but her rhythm had changed, and she was explaining now, not revealing, and the audience could feel the shift. Because identity isn't about boxes or check marks. It's about history, pain, and where you come from. Kennedy nodded once, but he didn't let go. I don't disagree, he said softly. But is that enough reason to shape legislation around it? The air left the room. This wasn't a gotcha. It wasn't culture war bait. It was a challenge on principle, not emotion. Warren leaned forward. When you're invisible, policy makes you disappear even more. Recognizing identity is how you counter erasure. Kennedy replied instantly. Same calm, same pause between words. Or is it how we substitute stories for standards? Now the audience shifted. A few murmurs, one audible, because Kennedy wasn't attacking her pain. He was asking why pain and identity were being institutionalized into law. It wasn't a moral attack, it was a philosophical one, and it was much harder to dismiss. The moderator stepped in. Senator Kennedy, can you elaborate? He nodded. I just want to understand. If we say identity should shape how government treats us, what happens when our identities collide? Who decides whose pain is policy and whose isn't? No one spoke. Even Warren didn't respond right away, because what Kennedy had asked wasn't controversial, it was fundamental. And for the first time in the conversation, Warren didn't have an answer, only another story. She had the stage, the story, and the sympathy. What she didn't have was the landing. Warren leaned into the mic. Her hands weren't shaking, but they were clenched now. Not in anger, in calculation. She was trying to recenter, to reclaim the ground she had just lost to one word. When you're told your whole life you don't belong in the room, she said, you learn to speak loud enough to be heard from the hallway. Identity isn't just a label, it's the reason people listen, or don't. The crowd offered soft nods, a few claps, but they were scattered. Kennedy didn't respond, not yet. The moderator stepped in to steer the moment. Senator Warren, are you suggesting identity should carry legislative weight, be written directly into law? She hesitated. I'm saying if we ignore identity, we ignore the unequal outcomes it creates. We can't write fair policy unless we understand the people it affects. Kennedy finally stirred. But how do you measure that, he asked. What happens when someone feels excluded by the way someone else feels included? Warren replied quickly, too quickly. You listen to the ones who've been silenced longest. Kennedy leaned in. What if they disagree with each other? A hush fell again. Not confrontational, not cruel, just relentless logic. Because Warren was speaking from experience. Kennedy was speaking to governance. And slowly the audience began to sense the separation. One woman was telling her truth. The other was being asked, should truth become policy? Warren tried again. When I talk about my roots, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for recognition. So others don't have to fight the same fight I did. Kennedy tilted his head. And how do you make sure that recognition doesn't become resentment? Warren didn't answer, because the question wasn't rhetorical. It was strategic. Kennedy wasn't trying to win. He was trying to reveal the risk of turning identity into infrastructure, and pain into precedent. The crowd had come in leaning Warren's way, but now something was changing. There was no cheer, no gasp, just a slow, collective realization that Warren, for all her articulation, was defending something she hadn't fully defined. And Kennedy was asking the question her team had never prepared her for. She came with heart. He came with principle. And the room could only follow one. Warren took a breath. This time her voice came back stronger, more practiced. It was the tone of someone who's been rattled and knows she needs to reassert control. We legislate from identity, whether we admit it or not. Every law touches someone differently based on where they come from, what they've surveyed, what their name sounds like when it's said out loud. Some in the audience clapped. It was a well-crafted line, one she'd used in smaller town halls, and now delivered with conviction. But Kennedy didn't move. That may be true, he said, but that's not how the Constitution works. We don't make laws for feelings. We make laws for people, all of them, whether they feel seen or not. Warren leaned forward. Then how do you explain laws that disproportionately harm communities of color? Of course, identity matters. Of course, it shows up in outcomes. You can't fix what you refuse to name. Kennedy didn't flinch. I'm not refusing to name it, ma'am. I'm refusing to legislate by emotion. Because when law follows pain instead of principle, you don't get justice. You get vengeance dressed up as virtue. The moderator sat still. The crowd? Mixed. Some clapped, others murmured, but no one was bored. Warren responded with a quieter force. You're trying to remove identity from a country built on it. People weren't just oppressed because they were poor. They were oppressed because of who they were. And if we don't correct that specifically, we don't correct it at all. Kennedy nodded once. Then let me ask this. If I pass a law that helps everyone equally, but doesn't name a single identity group, does it still count? Warren blinked. Not if it ignores the reality of disparity. Kennedy leaned back in his chair. So now laws have to name tribes to be considered moral? No reply, because the argument wasn't about inclusion anymore. It had become about definition and control. Warren was fighting to prove that pain deserves policy. Kennedy was pushing back with a warning. What happens when every group demands that their story become law? And for the first time, some in the audience, including those who had cheered Warren earlier, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Because Kennedy wasn't shouting. He wasn't belittling. He was asking the very thing identity politics avoids. What if feelings and fairness don't always walk together? She went for resolve. He stayed with reason, and for the first time, the audience couldn't decide what side they were on. The moderator glanced at the clock. 30 minutes had passed, but the temperature in the room said something bigger had shifted. Warren leaned in. You know, Senator Kennedy, I don't expect you to understand what it means to be erased, but I do expect you to believe me when I say identity doesn't ask for power. It asks to be acknowledged. Her voice rose, not loud but resolute. This was her final pass at control. When people hear their story in the law, they believe the system sees them. That's not favoritism. That's democracy finally looking people in the eye. Some scattered applause returned, but it wasn't triumphant. It was tentative. Kennedy sat forward slightly. No grin, no dramatics. Senator, I hear you, and I believe you. But if our laws only work when they tell personal stories, then they stop working for the people without one. The room paused again. He didn't wait for approval. He didn't even check the crowd's reaction. Because he wasn't talking to them anymore. He was talking to the principle itself. I don't mind seeing people, he added. I just mind when identity replaces ideas. Warren opened her mouth, but the moderator cut in. We have to wrap here. Final thoughts in 30 seconds. Warren looked tired. Not defeated, but drained. This wasn't the ending she had planned. I'll just say this, she offered. If we ever reach a point where people's names and backgrounds are stripped from policy, we'll have sanitized injustice so clean, we won't even notice it anymore. The room didn't applaud. It sat with the sentence. Then Kennedy closed it out. He looked into the crowd. If identity is how we connect, good, but it can't be how we govern. Because policy based on identity always ends up building walls where we're supposed to build bridges. No music, no taglines, just air. And in that final pause, The crowd did something rare. Nothing. No cheer, no protest, just silence and thought. Because this wasn't a debate that ended in noise. It ended in staring down the question both sides had avoided for years. Can truth exist apart from the person telling it? The debate ended. The stage cleared. But one word refused to leave the room. The event wrapped without a winner. No confetti, no raised voices, just two senators, one shaken, one unchanged, stepping off opposite ends of the stage. Warren left first. Staff surrounded her quickly. She nodded to a few supporters, but her expression was hard to read. Not angry, not triumphant, just distant, like someone still processing a question they hadn't expected to face. Kennedy took longer to leave. He stopped to speak to one student near the front. No staff, no cameras, just a brief nod and a handshake. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He only said one word, but it shifted the whole damn thing." Later that night, clips began circulating. But it wasn't the sound bites that spread. It was the moment itself, the pause, the tension, the silence that spoke louder than either voice. One TikTok edit showed Kennedy saying, "Why?" then cutting to Warren's pause. No music, no text, just 5 seconds of shared breath. It pulled 8 million views in 2 days. Cable pundits couldn't agree. Some called Kennedy's question weaponized restraint. Others called it exactly the kind of uncomfortable truth politics needs more of. But one columnist wrote what most people felt. In a town full of noise, one man asked a question that didn't try to win, it tried to understand. And the scariest part? No one knew how to answer. Back in D.C., reporters tried to press Kennedy for follow-up. "Do you regret how blunt that was?" one asked. He smiled gently. "No, ma'am. Sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is not talk, just ask." The clip didn't trend, but it stayed, pinned at the top of quiet minds, shared in classrooms, quoted in churches, because in a moment of vulnerability, emotion, politics, and pain, one word stuck, not shouted, not rehearsed, not spun, just offered. Why? And long after the event ended, long after the lights dimmed and the headlines moved on, that word was still echoing. Like and subscribe if you believe asking honest questions matters more than delivering perfect answers. And tell us in the comments, when's the last time a politician made you stop and really think?